Good morning. I want to welcome you to Beacon Church online. We have had to change and do church differently for the next little while. We don't know how long that's going to be. So we're going to be offering some online services. We'll be offering smaller care groups for people who would call Beacon their church. We'd really encourage you to get involved in those. This is new territory for us and new territory, I think, probably for many people, many churches, many of us now engaging online to a degree that maybe we'd never done before. I would ask that you remember us in the many prayers that you're praying for all sorts of things at this time. I would ask that you would remember us. I just want to say a few words about the world in which we live and the impact of coronavirus. It's massive both across the world and across our nation. It's impacting our lives very directly in a way that most of us would never have experienced before. Things are changing, and they're changing fast. They're changing rapidly. Even from the beginning of this week to today, the way in which we are living now is so different. Things are uncertain. We don't know what's going to happen from tomorrow, let alone next week, next month. I imagine most of us have had to cancel events and dates and things that we had planned over the coming weeks and months. It's all been cancelled. Obviously, employment has stopped. Businesses have had to shut down. It's a massive thing that is happening to our nation right now. It's also a bit confusing because there are many different ideas, many different bits of advice that are being given. Obviously, the government are telling us one thing, and then you're hearing all sorts of different things on social media. You've got to be careful with all of that. You've got to be careful what you listen to and what you don't listen to. You've got to be careful to choose the right sources, because sometimes it's the very source of things that causes fear in people. It's also complex because this virus is new. We've not seen this type before. We've not had a strain of this in the world before, so no one knows exactly how to deal with it. There is no obvious vaccine right now. People are working on that, but those kinds of things don't come through very quickly. I recognise it's a time of great uncertainty and really a lot of fear and sadness in the hearts of many people. People are uncertain about their future, about their job, can they keep their mortgage going, all these kinds of things. And we as Christians face exactly the same challenges as the world around us. But we also point to a very different kind of response that we can have. Not because we are particularly special, but because we worship a God who is very different. Let me read you these verses from Hebrews chapter 6. Because God wanted to make the unchanging nature of his purpose very clear to the heirs of what was promised, he confirmed it with an oath. God did this so that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled to take hold of the hope set before us may be greatly encouraged. We have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. That's Hebrews chapter 16. Let's pray. Father, I want to give you thanks and praise because you are the unchanging God in a changing world. And right now we look to you, God, as those who would believe. Father, there may be some watching in who don't yet believe, but we point them to the same God that we ourselves look to. I ask that you would hear our prayers and that you would help me as I speak in Jesus' name. Amen. As I said earlier, we live in a world that is changing rapidly and daily, but we do not serve a God who is changing. God is unchanging. He is unchanging in his nature. He is unchanging in his purpose. He is unchanging in what he does. God does not change. And that's not because he doesn't, things don't happen that are different, but because of who he is and the greatness of his power. God doesn't need to change in order to be able to cope. God is aware of what is going on. God is not unaware of the world in which we live. We live in an uncertain world. We live in a world where we're not sure what's going to happen tomorrow or the next day or the next day. But we can be sure of the promises of God. God is sure. God is certain. God sealed his promises with an oath. He bound himself to the promises that he made to us. He hasn't changed over thousands of years. God has remained the same. As I said, we live in a confusing world, but God can't lie. God speaks clearly and truthfully. There is a hope that is steadfast and sure for us that we must cling to. The passage says, you who have fled to take hold of the hope. Right now, we need to flee and grab hold of the hope that we have in God. That's where we go. There is nowhere else to go. Right now, you see that in the world around you. There is nowhere else to go. But we must cling to the hope that we have in him. And by clinging to the hope we have in him, we point others to that very same hope. And then this passage tells us that we are to be greatly encouraged. You might not imagine right now that you could be encouraged. There are so many things that you're not sure about, so many things you're uncertain of, so many things that maybe you're sad about. I was talking to somebody yesterday who had to come back from university, and he'd obviously come back early, and therefore he'd missed out on all the normal end of term goodbyes and parties and just things that people do at the end of a term, whether they're at university, at school, or wherever they are. Missed out on all of that. So there was a sadness in his heart about it. But our anchor and his anchor stands firm and secure because it stands in God. It stands in the one thing in this world and in this universe that is unchanging. And it's important for us to remember that. It's important for us to live there. It's important for us to find ways every day to remind ourselves of the unchanging nature of God and the fact that he is certain and sure. But we are living in a world which is different, and it's massive. And so I want to just speak a little bit into those things. Nobody likes to be pushed around. Nobody likes to be forced to do things that they don't want to do. Nobody likes to be told, oh, you must do this or you must do that, particularly in your own time and in your own space. Nobody really likes that. But right now, it does feel like we are being pushed around a bit. It feels like we're being told to do things that we don't want to do, and we're being pushed into places and spaces that we don't want to go, that we don't really want to consider. The coronavirus is a serious threat to life, to health, and the response to that becomes a serious threat to the economy and to our society and our culture as we know it. In a way, the majority of us have never experienced before in our lives. It's pushing us into areas that we don't want to go, that we are sometimes unhappy to go. But I just want to say this. Some of the places that we are being pushed into because of this virus are not as bad as they might appear. Some of us may, over this period of time, shed tears of grief before this is all over. There is, however, an opportunity for things to be different, to be better, to be more healthy and more fruitful the other side of this. There is that possibility. And right now I want to look at where we are being pushed, those places, and the potential benefits for us if we are able to embrace those things. Firstly, we're being pushed to acknowledge our own humanity. We may have landed on the moon in the past 100 years and conquered the highest mountain peaks. We may have sailed many seas and all sorts of other things, but we are being reminded right now of the fragility of human life, the reality and the impact of fear. For some of us, our natural tendency for self-preservation and the anxiety that comes with an uncertain future, we are being reminded of all of that and experiencing all of that right now. Maybe, for some of us, we are realising we are slightly less powerful than we thought we were. We may well beat this in 12 weeks, but that is no guarantee. Acknowledging our humanity and the limitations of it is humbling. And some of us need to embrace this new place of humility. We are being pushed into a place of enforced inactivity. And that's difficult for some of us because we live in an activist culture. And so this comes as a bit of a culture shock. Why do we find it so difficult? Enforced inactivity can just be about handling things. And we're unable to do that, particularly where we didn't choose to. We simply react. If you tell me not to walk on the grass, that's the very reason that I might walk on the grass. There's an innate response that we no longer even think is wrong. Enforced inactivity, however, allows us to engage differently, to review and to reflect on life and habits, to deepen relationships, to connect with people in different ways. It allows for that. We're being pushed into a place where we are engaging in our families and our households in a much more intense way than we're used to. Even yesterday, my wife and I discovered we're only one day in and there are disagreements. There's tension. Families and households are the bedrock of any society. You travel around the world, you will find that the world and society is made up of families and households. But over the years, in our nation, we have not invested in them. And therefore, right now, this becomes a difficulty for us. Many of the problems we see in our society, the disconnection of young people, the growing numbers of vulnerable people accessing places like food bank, is precisely because families are not working the way that they should. This might seem strange, but we now have an opportunity to spend more time investing in family. For some of us, more time spent with family is a blessing. I love spending time with my family. For others, it is a point of tension. We have to be honest about that. And still for others, it's just difficult. So we acknowledge those challenges for people. But families are meant to be a source of strength and support and belonging. But often they are not. Right now, though, we're being pushed to spend more time to engage in our families. So how can we do that in a fruitful way? How can we make the most of that over the next weeks and months? Just a few things I want to mention. Firstly, just learning to accept the situation that we find ourselves in. Don't fight it. Don't forever be in conflict in yourself about the fact that you're in this situation. Accept it. That alone will help reduce tension because you can engage from a different perspective. Create space for one another. So even though we might all be cooped up in our homes for a while, we're not able to travel the way that we used to and do the things that we did, you can still create space for one another in that place. And that can help reduce tension, allowing people space to breathe and to be themselves. Agree together a new rhythm and routine of life during this period. And if you have children, you'll know that that's essential. And I've no doubt that schools are recommending ways in which you can do that. Find new routines, new rhythms to life. Include grace and redemption into the family. What I mean by that is learning to accept one another the way we are and learning to forgive and say sorry on a regular basis. Let those be hallmarks of the family. If we invest in that way, our families can come out of this very, very different to how they've gone in. Let's begin to practice those things. The next place that we are being pushed is to isolation. Some of us, let's be honest, we hate being alone. We're rarely alone. We're always with other people. We leave work and we go out with our friends. We only go home to sleep. Some of us, that's just the way it is. This will now be a new experience. How will we handle life when all the usual stuff is not around us? I can't go to the gym. I can't go to the cinema. I'm not at the theatre. I can't go for a drink. All of those things are not there. It's just me, myself and I and the household that I live in. Reflection can be a good thing. It's to be encouraged. But over-reflection can be unhealthy. We can go to dark places that we shouldn't be going to. Therefore, we need to find a balance. You still need, if you're in that situation, if you are isolated, create your own routines. Engage positively with others. If you are not on your own, but you have time and space, then you should be connecting and contacting people who are isolated. Get into the habit of listening to people. It's one of the best ways to really get understanding of who they are and what they're like. I would encourage you as a pastor, pick up your Bible, read it. Read through the Psalms in the Old Testament. Read through the Gospels in the New Testament. Those are two parts of the Bible that are the easiest to read, the easiest to understand who God is and what he has done for us, and how we can respond to him. So isolation can be a thing. Another place that we are being pushed into is to think about the vulnerable, to think about the sick, to think about the weak, and that is actually a good thing. We know that the most three critical groups that are involved in this illness and could be impacted by this illness are the elderly, are people who have underlying health issues, and pregnant mothers. Mainly because we don't know with pregnant mothers what the impact will be on them of this outbreak. We are being forced to think about others. And that's never a bad thing. Forced to think about others. It does lead to many acts of random kindness, and we're seeing that all over. But also, we begin to see acts of, I suppose, self-preservation, selfishness, as people are being exposed maybe because they're not thinking about others. But we do want to support the most vulnerable, the sick in our society, the elderly and the young. I know we as a church, we've been thinking really hard about how do we look out for and look after the most vulnerable in our community. It's quite a big task, but we're recognising the complexity of the needs and the circumstances of those things. I'm asking you, fight the innate tendency for self-preservation and for fear, which can lead to selfish acts. Find passages of the Bible that remind you of who God is and what he has done for you. The next place I believe we're being pushed is to consider more than normal what we really believe in. For some of us, belief may well be just a collection of opinions or random thoughts, and maybe we've picked them up on YouTube or somewhere else. For others, we don't give deeply held beliefs much thought at all. However, in a time of crisis like we are in now, the reality of life tests our beliefs. And whether we have any beliefs, whether we have an anchor for our soul, is being tested right now. Right now, as a nation, we're putting a lot of our faith in science, both medical and social. Sadly for me, as a nation, we seem to be putting less of our faith in God and prayer. However, for people of faith, such as you and I, put your faith in God. Tell him every day, I'm going to trust you, God, to get me, my family, and our nation through this. I'm going to trust you. And then the final place that I just want to mention of us being pushed is the place of prayer. And I think particularly for the Christian, you're being pushed there, but it may be that you're not a Christian, or you have people around you who are not Christians, and they are being pushed to pray. They're being pushed to talk to someone higher than themselves. Some of us already pray lots, I know that. But now there is a greater need for us to pray. I found my prayers have simplified, although they have become more intense. One of my most regular prayers right now is, God, have mercy. God, have mercy on us. We don't deserve his mercy. We now have no rights to his mercy, but we ask for his mercy. This prayer is where, as Christians, we can have the biggest impact. Many of us over this period should be growing very, very strong prayer muscles, because we should be praying. We are being pushed to pray. You remember the story of Abraham, when God was about to destroy the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, and he speaks to Abraham, and in that conversation you can see Abraham praying for the city, interceding on behalf of the city. Oh God, if there are 50 righteous, would you spare the city? And he goes on. He prays without giving up, and we must learn to pray and not give up. The situation we are in is difficult. I acknowledge that. The fear that we're seeing around us is massive and it's real. And for some of us, we are overwhelmed by it ourselves. Although remember, I am saying we need to look to God. He is the anchor for our souls. But where I've just outlined a number of places that this pandemic pushes us, maybe places we don't want to go, every one of those places there is an opportunity for us to reflect, to change, and to be fruitful. Loads of stories have been going around on social media this week, and I heard one just a couple of days ago. It's an amazing story about the Ebola epidemic, the outbreak of 2014. There'd been outbreaks of Ebola previously, I think back to the 70s, but apparently the one in 2014 was the worst than all of those previous ones put together. Health experts claimed that 1 million lives would be lost within 3 months. Christians began to pray. In fact, they began to pray through Psalm 91 for 91 days. And on the 91st day, they were told that the Ebola crisis had passed. Not fully, but it had certainly hit its peak and it had passed. Over that period of time, 28,000 people contracted Ebola across the world. 11,000 people died. A huge number of people, but way less than what was predicted. There is a call again for us as Christians to pray. Simple but daily faith-filled prayers for God to show mercy to our world again. I want to pray now as we close. Father, I want to give you thanks and praise. Lord, you're with us. I want to ask that you would continue to guide and lead us. Protect us, O God. Have mercy on us. In Jesus' name. Amen.